Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of A Foggy Day on Olympus, the place where we trample upon ideological self justifications and seek an Olympian view of issues of history, religion, and culture, and why they matter. My name is Coel Campo.
And my name is Mike Pierce. At least that's what Nurse told me when she brought me my supper just now. This is the fifth episode in our series on 16th and 17th century religious radicals. And today it's the turn of the Baptists to have their romantic illusions shattered.
Right, because that's how we roll here at A Foggy Day on Olympus.
Indeed, it is.
Okay, so now what's with this funky title, The Dippers Dipt?
Yes, well, the Dippers Dipt was a pamphlet written in the 1640s, so during the English Civil War, attacking the Baptists. So if viewers look closely, they can see the Dippers Dipt, or the Anabaptists ducked and plunged over head and ears in a disputation in Southwark. So Daniel Featley, whom we'll meet in a moment, giving his version of a debate that he had with them. Although even that is giving some ground to them, because a few years before there would be no public disputations with such people. They would have been clapped in irons and there was an end of it. And the fact that that's not really possible at that particular time is one of the things that's upsetting him. So we're going to be looking at the watery origins of the Baptists. So over the sea in the Netherlands and then coming back to England. But that's for a minute or two. So this is our author, Daniel Featley. He was a dyspeptic but moderate clergyman. The line he held was not radical within the Church of England. He wasn't a radical Puritan, but he certainly didn't like the emergent High Church party during the reign of Charles I, that there had been such a thing since 1625. But he was dyspeptic in the way that he castigated various parties. So he wrote polemics against Catholics, against Arminians in the Church of England, and sectarians like the Baptists. The upsurge in sectarianism, Separatists, Baptists, and so on, during the Civil War alarmed him greatly. And in this, he certainly reflected majority opinion.
Now, I know who Arminians are, but can we spell that out?
Yes, well, Arminians classically mean those who hold to a rather moderate form of free will theology. I always remember how many years ago, my tutor in Oxford humorously described Arminius as a moderate Calvinist. Which is not the definition that would recommend itself to most popular audiences, but was in fact correct. But we need to say something special about Arminianism in England in the first half of the 17th century. That it was not a particular kind of evangelicalism where we locate it mostly nowadays. On the contrary, it was married with a new high church party that wanted to emphasize ceremonial. So, as it were, to do exactly the opposite of everything the Puritans wanted. So, he is hacking away at those.
Okay, right. And probably we should also mention sectarianism because we're using that here in a sociological and not a theological sense, right?
Right, yes. So, sectarianism, in the sense we're using it here, doesn't refer to theological deviations. It might include those, but that's not the central point. The central point is that these are groups that have broken away from the commonly accepted compulsory religion, in this case, the Church of England. So that's all he's saying there, really.
So basically anybody that's not the Church of England.
Yes. Well, not including Catholics, but certainly outside of that, yes.
Okay, and then finally, the Civil War period. I realize this is, of course, a vast subject in itself, but especially for non-Brits, can we at least indicate like what kind of time frame we're talking about here?
Yes, I mean, this is an extremely complicated subject. Several lifetimes ago now, when I was a school teacher in England for a few years, I taught an A-level syllabus to pupils aged 16 to 18, spending 2 years just going over the English Civil War. And if you really want to get a grasp on it, that is what you're going to need. The chapter in The Great Restoration, of which more in a moment, that I am most proud of is the one that reduces that complexity to about 12 pages without distorting things too much and still remaining intelligible. It is extremely complicated, but the time frame we're talking about is from the late summer of 1642 onwards, when the political tensions inside England explode into armed conflict. But generally, we denominate the whole 2 decades of the 1640s and 1650s as the Civil War period. Right? If we want to be precise about it, we'd have to say there were 3 civil wars, all of them returning the same military result. But the first one was by far the biggest and the longest, yes.
The definition of insanity comes to mind.
Yeah, but most civil wars are,
Right.
So, yes. Okay, so we've got an illustration here from Featley's most famous publication. And it's a description of the several sorts of Anabaptists. But we need to remember that Anabaptists was then a catch-all term for radicals of any kind. So it was a term used rather like fascists or fundamentalists or extremists or something like that, whereby people nowadays give their brains permission to turn off and simply to shriek. I don't like it, right? It's not that the words are without meaning, they do have a meaning, as Anabaptism did then, but that meaning was very rarely honoured. It was simply a blanket term to cover radicals of all sorts. So several of the kinds shown here, there's all these little circles, we're not going to go through all of them, but viewers will be free to pause the video and look more closely at their leisure. Several of the kinds shown here laboured under the disadvantage of never having actually existed, and others, like the Cathars, of having flourished centuries before, mostly in southern France. So it's about 400 years out of date.
Okay, so if some of these groups are actually fictitious or irrelevant in that case, why is Featley raising the alarm about them?
Well, a couple of reasons. One is that people love to give themselves anxieties about the desperate changes that are going on. So it's almost like the same kind of reason that people watch horror films. They kind of like to scare themselves. But part of it, and this is a point to which we might return in a few minutes, is the kind of education that someone like Featley will have had, which is pretty rigid schooling in a certain system and a whole load of categories. And these are the things, he will have been told, that you need to worry about. And the things will then have been presented in their most repellent guise, and they will have been idée fixe in his mind thereafter, and he will have been primed to see them, whatever he experiences in his future life. And surprise, surprise, he does. Right? Anabaptists, he will have been told, are wicked people practicing polygamy, communism, and capital punishment for everything in the city of Münster. And therefore, any radical should be stigmatized as an Anabaptist and a danger to all established order.
Right. We better not draw any modern parallels here, maybe.
No, I mean, whatever our present woes, most rhetoric is not quite as bad in that respect. In many others, of course, it's many times worse. Yes. Now, Featley, in his pamphlet, dismissed all Baptist preachers as russet rabbis and mechanic enthusiasts and profound watermen. The watermen are people who will have rowed your boat across the Thames back and forth for you to ferry you about, and sublime coachmen and illuminated tradesmen.
Okay, this sounds like he's hating on Baptists and tradespeople at the same time. Is that what's going on
Yeah,
here?
it's a social sneer that these people can't possibly know what's true because they haven't had my kind of education.
Right.
That sort of thing. And of course, to an extent, he's right. Modern sensibilities notwithstanding, there is something in that, but his own kind of background is not going to come exactly without its own prejudices and distortions either, to say the very least.
Right. Well, coming up next, we've been pushing this book in every episode of the series so far, and today's topic is actually expanded on at slightly greater depth in chapters 10, 11, and 13.
Yes, it certainly is. So if anybody wants to get hold of that, that's where to go to. I want to just take a very brief opportunity to stress that what we're giving in, well, every episode in A Foggy Day on Olympus, actually, and certainly applies to this series, is a simplification of a simplification, right? My book is an introductory book for undergraduate students. That's what it is, right? There is an ocean of material out there if people want to specialize. And what we're giving in these episodes is a simplified version, even of what you get in The Great Restoration. There's a warning here, and this is just flagging up something that we're going to be discussing in a one-off episode once this series is finished. And that is that a lot of people surf the internet, watch podcasts or vodcasts like this, and by the time they've watched 100 of them, pronounce themselves experts. And you aren't, and you won't be. Right? That's going to require an awful lot more work. I mean, this kind of outlook is reflected in one or two of the comments that we've had on YouTube from people who are pronouncing themselves experts when they're very obviously not and are familiar only with looking at these kind of things. What we're giving here is an overview and an introduction as dispassionately as we can. So, yes, my book will take you in a little deeper, and then believe me, there is an ocean to wade into after that.
Right.
Right.
And on the other hand, if anybody wants to claim that these podcasts are too dense, you could remember that you could have had a 2-year course on the English Civil War alone.
You could, yes. And even then you would have more to learn. Right. That's just A-level. That's not even college.
Oh, those
Right.
poor students.
Well, poor students, but poor me. I mean, one of the ironies of that situation was that this was almost exactly the syllabus I had undertaken myself when I had been their age. Right.
Well, nobody feels any sympathy for you, so.
No, I realise, especially anybody called Coel Campo. Right.
Okay, so moving on, we're going to look at the separatists here. And we dealt with them in the last episode. And we said that they wanted to separate from the Church of England and start over, while the Puritans wanted to purify the Church of England. Is that basically right?
Right, yes. That is the principal distinction. Puritans wanting to purify the Church of England, separatists saying it's never going to happen. We want it to happen, but in fact, we think it never will. And so we are going to separate. So they're living lives as sectarians in practice, even though they don't believe in sects, right? I'm pronouncing that word carefully. They believe in a compulsory state church, but theirs not the one that is actually in place. And whilst they are present in London and some other places, the largest and most important groups of them are actually living in exile in the Netherlands.
Right. And so last week we saw how one of these groups went to New England and became the Pilgrim Fathers.
Yes, that's right, yes.
Okay, so what is the dilemma that we're referring to here?
The dilemma is, as we're about to see, that the separatist position itself collapses by degrees into a believer's church, even though that's not what they consciously believed in or wanted at all. This is, as we referred to in the previous episode, the triumph of sociology over theology in the long run, that Christians tend to theologize their lived experience. Now, sometimes that's okay because it's going on in the early church as well, and sometimes it's not okay. And here, well, they're living in the Netherlands, which de facto has religious toleration, which is why they're allowed to live there. But as part of that circumstance, there are Mennonites around who are no longer being persecuted by the turn of the century. And some of the separatists are coming into contact with one of the most moderate and sane and sensible type of Mennonites, people we call the Waterlanders. And this brings us to the career of this remarkable individual, John Smith. He had been ordained in the Church of England in 1594 when he would already been 40 years old, which is perhaps itself a little unusual. People tended to get ordained, well, the minimal canonical age was 23, so then or thereabouts. So he'd left it a while. He's a Puritan from around 1600, so still within the Church of England. He becomes a separatist in 1607 and goes over to the Netherlands. And because partly of the contacts that he has with Waterlander Mennonites, but even more from following through a particularly rigorous kind of separatist logic, he ends up becoming the first English Baptist.
Now, you could look at this and say that Smith is religiously unstable. Or is it that he's just following through step by step on a continuum of logic?
Well, he is following through on the continuum of logic, because the separatists, as we saw last week, and we really would refer people back to this to see what was going on and how they thought and so on. The separatists defined themselves entirely in terms of what I call a notness. We are not the Church of England church, and that's why we've separated from it. It's not a proper church. It retains loads of remnants from Roman Catholicism, and this is wrong about it, and that's wrong about it, and the other thing is wrong. Its ministry is no true ministry because they're appointed by bishops, and there shouldn't be bishops, and so on. Well, okay, fine, if that's what you think. But there's a problem with this. If that's the case, are its sacraments true sacraments? Separatists start to squirm. They certainly are not happy with the way that communion is celebrated. Well, is its baptism a true baptism? Because if it's not, then none of us separatists have been properly baptized because we were all christened as babies in our parish churches in the Church of England, and we should be baptized properly now. But if it is giving a proper baptism, that kind of implies that it is a true church and we should stop being separatists. Now, Puritans had for long been pitching into the separatists about this and saying, you either need to come back to the Church of England and recognise it's a true church, or you need to go forward to Anabaptism with all of the detestation that would bring down upon your heads from everybody. So this is a tough spot. And Smith follows through on this logic and says, well, actually, we need to be rebaptized. Well, what I'd like to do is read you here about a page and a quarter, not from the Great Restoration, but from this book, The Age of Reason, which was my contribution to the Baker History of the Church. It covers the period from 1570 to 1789. It's a kind of global church history, so it's another very general book. But I allow myself permission to muse not just about this particular circumstance, though I am writing about that, but what that reflects upon religious debates generally in the 16th and 17th centuries by all parties. So here we go. Baptism was merely the lightning conductor for a general tendency of all churches and even factions within them during the Reformation period, for all employed Aristotelian arguments to debunk churches that were more conservative than themselves, and Platonic ones to fend off criticisms from radicals to their own left. Now, if that's losing you, we'll come back and rescue you now. Aristotelian arguments define things in terms of the sum total of their characteristics, or accidents, to use the philosophical jargon. So if a church could be shown to have corruptions of various kinds, and critics were good at magnifying these, then it might be inferred that they were no true churches at all. This was the standard line of attack by Protestants against the Church of Rome. And it was used in turn by separatists against the Church of England. Platonic arguments, by contrast, define things in terms of their supposed essence, which is allegedly unaffected by mere empirical characteristics. Modern psychobabble plays the same game when it contends that the real me is somehow different from the person who has demonstrably just lied, cheated, or stolen. Right? So when the critics found the Aristotelian solvent applied against their own churches by those more radical than themselves, they reversed their previous arguments to show that unfortunate blemishes did not destroy the essential churchness of their own favoured institution. The need to play this foolish game left many theologians, especially Protestant reformers, engaged furiously in doublethink, brackets, or balance, as their modern apologists like to call it, says Pierce, taking a sideswipe at not a few reformed commentators. On the one hand, the Protestant reformers expended unthinkable volumes of ink over mind-numbing deforestations of paper, in tirades designed to demonstrate beyond contradiction that the Pope was Antichrist. Then, a few pages later, they would reverse themselves to point out that the Church of Rome was, nevertheless, in some sense, they could not quite say how, a true church, at least insofar as the crucial matter of administering a valid baptism was concerned, though certainly no further. The lightning conductor again. For if the Aristotelianism were maintained to the last, then the christening that the entire population of newly Protestantized lands had received as infants under popery would be invalid. It would have to be performed afresh according to Lutheran or Reformed rites. This never happened. It would have been far too embarrassing, and that for two reasons. In the first place, the administrator of the new true baptism in a Protestant state church would 9 times out of 10 be the same person who had served as a Catholic priest at the original ceremony. The Protestant rhetoric about a clean break with a papist past would have a face-reddening brush with parish reality. Even more importantly, to perform rebaptism of any kind with whatever claimed justification considerably weakened one of the central arguments against Anabaptism. Better then to maintain that the Roman Catholic Church was simultaneously the whore of Babylon described in the book of Revelation and in some measure a true church, a body possessed by both Antichrist and Christ. It was all very Augustinian. So that's the point that these separatists have come to with Smith. Right. So he's pushing the separatist logic through to its conclusion, but he's also being influenced by his contacts with local Dutch Waterlander Mennonites. And in early 1609, he rebaptizes himself and the larger portion of his own congregation to form a Baptist church. Now, we have his confession of faith, but for the sake of brevity, I'm just bullet pointing the central points that we should note here. So he believes now in a general atonement. He has abandoned Calvinism. So he's accepting a belief in free will. The point of Calvinism, it might be remembered from earlier episodes, is that it says you can't know who the true Christians are, so you can't baptize them. You can't have a believer's church, right? You can know concerning yourself and no other person. He denies Augustinian original sin.
And to understand why Augustinian original sin and infant baptism are closely connected ideas, you should see episode 4 of our series, The End of the Early Church.
Yes, please do. So, yeah, expresses an orthodox Christology, a very badly expressed version of the Anabaptist doctrine of justification. Viewers who haven't already seen it, please look 2 episodes back in this series to our 3rd episode, where we look at what Anabaptists taught about justification by faith. They believed in it, but only in a faith that actually transformed your life. John Smith, for such a highly intelligent man, makes a very bad job indeed of expressing that thought. He holds to believers' baptism, and that the church consists simply of baptized believers. And he takes sides in an internal Mennonite debate about the ban and comes to the more generous view. Hardline or very legalistic Mennonites said that if you expel someone from the congregation for unrepented sin or heresy of some kind, you then shouldn't mix with them in social life or trade or anything either. Whereas the Waterlanders took a more humane, sensible, and moderate view, and Smith came down in favour of that.
So, based on this last point, it sounds like Smith becomes a Mennonite.
Well, in the end, he did. So a little bit up the road, he changes his mind and thinks that it had been a mistake for him to baptize himself, and that he and his followers all needed to join with the Mennonites and be baptized again by them. But some of them decided that they were already quite wet enough and stayed out. But he did lead a fair number into communion with the Mennonites and merging with them. But that's not the story we're going to be following. Now, I should recommend 2 very good books here, sadly both out of print, but very detailed, and each of them can be found secondhand online for around $50. One by James Coggins, John Smith's Congregation, English Separatism, Mennonite Influences. And the second one is looking particularly at the theology of John Smith, and that's by Jason Lee. Just as a pure personal aside here, I should say that Jason Lee was an American doing his PhD under that excellent fellow Carl Truman in Aberdeen University. And his PhD was the occasion of the only time I've ever been an external examiner for a PhD. And he'd done a really good job there. So, yes, recommending that. But we need to turn now to this man, Thomas Helwys. After Smith and many of his followers had defected to the Mennonites, Thomas Helwys becomes the leader of the remaining General Baptists.
Okay, so these are the people that didn't want to go with Smith along to
Right.
along with the Mennonites. Okay, right.
Yes.
So why are we calling them General Baptists?
Well, because, as we're about to find, there are two kinds of Baptists. The Baptists have not one Genesis, but two, quite close together, and certainly with significant differences. And the General Baptists were not called that at the time, but we call them that to distinguish them from the others, the particular Baptists. And this is to do with their differing theologies of the atonement. So the General Baptists are non-Calvinistic. They believe, along with the New Testament, that Christ has died for the sins of the world. There is a general atonement, right? And as we shall see, the others do not hold to that. So we can sum up Helwys's theology and that of the General Baptists. Again, there's a confession of faith, but we're reducing it just to bullet points here. It's very similar to what Smith is saying, except on a couple of important points. So they too hold to a general atonement and free will, but they stick with Augustinian original sin. They deny Calvinism's perseverance of the saints. They think that people can fall away. They hold to an orthodox Christology, believers' baptism, of course, the more generous view concerning that internal Mennonite debate about the ban. But they also rejected Mennonite pacifism. And they rejected the Mennonites' rejection of oaths. They said you could take an oath, it was lawful. So, on those three key points, original sin, pacifism, non-pacifism, and oaths, they are more conservative than the Mennonites. Well, within a few years, a couple of years, they had decided that God was telling them they should return to England and accept persecution, which they did. So in 1612, they go back. Most of them are imprisoned. Helwys dies in prison, though he manages to write a few things whilst imprisoned. And we are not well informed about the future of the movement over the next, let us say, 15 years. But by the late 1620s, we have documents showing that there were, despite the persecution, 5 General Baptist congregations in England, scattered around quite a bit, not just in London. In future years, they will grow much more. But we're going to leave their story there for now and look at the second Genesis.
I feel like Alice in Wonderland here. It's just curiouser and curiouser. I mean, what in the world is semi-separatism?
Well, it's people who are separate in fact, but not separatist in the sense of denouncing the Church of England as no true church. A remarkable congregation comes into existence in London in 1616, and it's led by a man called Henry Jacob, who had a pretty long history as a Puritan agitator, and the Puritans, as we pointed out last week, spend a long time getting absolutely nowhere. And he decided to set up his own church, which of course was completely illegal, in London. But it would not be separatist. It did not denounce the Church of England as being a false church. And here is an excerpt from its confession. We believe concerning mixtures of the open profane, that is, obviously ungodly people, with some manifest godly Christians in a visible church, and they're talking here about the Church of England, though at once it doth not destroy essentially, there's that Platonic category again, nor make void the holiness of that whole assembly, yet truly it putteth that whole assembly into a most dangerous and desperate estate. And the historian Murray Tolmie, who I'm going to recommend very strongly in a few minutes, points out that this confession was full of separatist language, even as it deliberately avoided drawing the full separatist conclusion.
So it sounds like they kind of have a foot on both sides here. And this flexibility must have had some practical advantages for them.
Yes, it had two main advantages. By not being separatist, it meant that they could stay in touch with Puritan leaders in the Church of England who would probably not denounce them to the authorities. I mean, a load of them did end up getting arrested and imprisoned for a while at one point, but not everybody was going to denounce them, certainly amongst Puritans. So you could keep fairly sweet diplomatic relations there. But it also had another kind of advantage, that members of Jacob's Church could, on occasion, go along to their regular Church of England parish churches. So it wouldn't be obvious that they were never attending their parish churches, and that enabled them to avoid detection, or at least improve their chances. So two kinds of advantages for them there. Well, this church grew pretty fast. In fact, they split a few years up the road, not on any acrimonious grounds, but because they'd become so big, it was getting harder and harder for them to avoid detection. So one ends up in the west end of London and another in the east end of London. But they also have some other breakaways. So some people split because they decided they really felt they should be separatist. So there are more separatist churches coming out of them. At some point in the 1630s, they moved towards becoming Baptists, or at least some of them do, on the rather flimsy ground, as I would say, that they should do this because the Bible says so. Which, for the genuine Anabaptists, the Mennonites, and for the general Baptists, looks extremely feeble, because from their point of view, yes, certainly the Bible does say so, but it's part of a much bigger shift in understanding what the church is. Whereas these people are making a merely incremental move, and they're carrying all their Calvinism and all the mindset that had shaped them as Puritans with them into becoming this other kind of Baptist. So we've got a record here, this excerpt of a record anyway, from these first particular Baptists taken from out of the Jacob Church. So in 1638, Mr. Thomas Wilson, Mr. Penn, and H. Penn, and three more, being convinced that baptism was not for infants, but professed believers, joined with Mr. John Spilsbury, the church's favour being desired therein. In 1640, the third month, that would be May from their way of reckoning, maybe not the point to make a digression here about how the calendar worked back then. The church became two by mutual consent, just half being with Mr. P. Barebone. His first name was Praise God. When I introduce him in the Great Restoration, I say, Praise God Barebone, a man of evidently Puritan parentage. Who else is going to give their kid a name like that, right? And the other half with Mr. Henry Jesse. Mr. Richard Blunt, with him being convinced of baptism, that also it ought to be by dipping the body into the water, resembling burial and rising again. Colossians 2:12, Romans 6:4, had sober conference about in the church, and then with some of the forenamed, who also were so convinced, and after prayer and conference about their so enjoying it, none having then so practised in England to professed believers, and hearing that some in the Netherlands had so practised, they agreed and sent over Mr. Richard Blunt, who understood Dutch, with letters of commendation, who was kindly accepted there, and returned with letters from them. They proceed on therein, viz., those persons that were persuaded baptism should be by dipping the body had met in two companies, and did intend so to meet after this. All these agreed to proceed alike together. And then, manifesting not by any formal words a covenant, which word was scrupled by some of them, but by mutual desires and agreement, each testified. Those two companies did set apart one to baptize the rest, so it was solemnly performed by them. Mr. Blunt baptized Mr. Blakelock, that was a teacher amongst them, and Mr. Blunt being baptized, he and Mr. Blakelock baptized the rest of their friends that were so minded, and many being added to them, they increased much.
I have one tiny comment. The Y and the E, thee and not ye.
Yes, there is a word from this period, ye, which is the plural of you. Think God rest ye merry gentlemen. But most of the time, and think of old fashioned in signs, it's the, because the Anglo Saxon letter thorn, which was a hard TH, had been written as though it were a Y for a very long time. Everybody in that period knew that it was pronounced as a hard TH. And so what looks to us like ye, when it doesn't mean the plural of you, is simply pronounced the. So that sign on the inn near you, it's the older oka inna, not ye oldie okie inni. Right. There you go. All right, that's for an extra freebie.
Right.
Nothing to do with our subject. Now, we have just been paddling around there in a document taken from these absolutely inestimable books. It's one of the many ironies of life that nothing dates like history, unless your name is Champlain Burridge. He was an American scholar who produced these 2 volumes of original documents in 1912, and they remain a primary resource for students today. The Cambridge University Press, which originally brought them out, decided about, I haven't checked inside the covers, but about 15 or 20 years ago that the old hardbacks had by now fully disintegrated in everybody's collections, and it really would be a good idea to bring out paperbacks because people were still wanting to use them.
Well, yay for America.
Yay for America, absolutely. A sterling job he did. All right, well, staying also with America, we should come to this man, Glenn Stack, who brings out a really superb article in the early 1960s, delineating for us carefully the differences between the General Baptists and the Particular Baptists, not just about their theology, but about their mentality. And his comments are absolutely on the nail. English separatism, which we looked at last week, describes not merely the act of forming a new church, but the main motif in their theology. Their central concern was to prove that all other churches, especially Anglican churches, were false and to establish a pure church. Non-separatism or semi-separatism, which we've just looked at, identifies the followers of Henry Jacob, who contended that the Church of England was a true church and maintained fellowship with them as long as possible. The central concepts in the theology of the separatists were falseness and purity, and their spirit was polemical. The central concept in the non-separatists, on the other hand, was Calvin's doctrine of God, and their spirit was ecumenical. The General Baptists originated in the separatist movement, and their central concepts were falseness and purity. So they go on to become pretty rigid and legalistic. The Particular Baptists, by contrast, originated in the mother church of non-separatism and were non-separatists. Their theology was Calvinistic and was not concerned to establish a pure church or a pure individual. And this really gets that exactly right and explains how you come to have that boiling ice phenomenon, Calvinistic Baptists, right? The whole of the Calvinistic or Reformed structure exists to legitimize a Protestant compulsory state church. And yet it gets transferred by degrees via the non-separatism or semi-separatism of Henry Jacob's church to the Particular Baptists.
So, kind of in summary here, Stassen is saying separatists and their offspring are the General Baptists, and they're rigid and polemical. And then semi separatists and their offspring are the Particular Baptists, and they're more soft edged.
Yes, Although I think if you and I could go back in Doctor Who's TARDIS to the 17th century and meet any of these guys, we would come away throwing our hands in the air and saying they are all really rigid. It's a question of degrees. And on that, I agree with Stassen. He gets that right. Especially because the particular Baptists were so desperate, as we shall see in a moment, to be liked by the wider Puritan fraternity. Now, in the fall of 1640, Charles I calls the Long Parliament. It wasn't called the Long Parliament at the time. People didn't realise how long it would sit. But from then on, England is sliding inexorably towards serious internal conflict. And the ability of authority to impose itself in religious matters is coming unstuck. And sectarians are starting to meet more and more openly. So in 1641, one pamphlet by an alarmed conservative includes this line drawing. So, on the one hand, we have the Orthodox true minister in a church with pillars and everybody listening. On the other hand, we have the seducer and false prophet, and he's some ordinary person, presumably not a clergyman, preaching out of a window under an inn sign, the Bell Inn, I guess. So a pub to people, just a crowd gathering outside in the open air. And some people even listening up in trees, rather like in the Gospels. I think that detail might have been a shot in the foot by the cartoonist, but there we are. Yes. So sectarians coming out into the open. Here we've got another example from the same year of conservative opinion terrifying itself with imaginary heretics, the Adamites, a group that's supposed to have gone around stark naked like Adam and Eve before the fall. But the very fact that people are saying such ridiculous things shows the alarm that was felt by a lot of established and conservative opinion. What is going wrong? These people are coming out of every nook and cranny. And so separatists of various kinds, the semi-separatists, both kinds of Baptists, and it's about to become a lot more varied even than that. They seem to be everywhere. And so that is alarming a lot, particularly of churchmen. Now, one book I would recommend very, very strongly. It's a superb classic study by Murray Tolmie, who we mentioned a few minutes ago, now out of print. But if you're going to splash out $70 on a second-hand book, this would be the one to spend your money on. So he's looking at the separate churches, so sectarians of all kinds, in London, from 1616, when Henry Jacob established his church, through to 1649, which is the year that Charles I is executed and the Republic is set up. Okay, well, the particular Baptists do particularly well in this new environment. And in 1645, they issue their first confession of faith. Although, as we shall see from these opening pages, they are facing a lot of public backlash. So, this is the confession of faith of those churches, which are commonly, though falsely, called Anabaptists, because as we know, Anabaptism simply meant more radical than the person speaking happened to like. But the stripe against them was that they did actually baptize believers, presented to the view of all that fear God, for the taking off those aspersions which are frequently in pulpit and print, although unjustly, cast upon them. But being it's not only us, but the truth professed by us, we cannot, we dare not, but speak. It's no strange thing to any observing man what sad charges are laid, not only by the world that know not God, but also by those that think themselves much wronged if they be not looked upon as the chief worthies of the church of God.
Now, in the next couple of slides, we're going to see, like you had mentioned a few minutes ago, that really this is a hard push for acceptance and respectability, isn't it?
They want to be accepted by Puritans. They know they've already got acceptance of people like semi-separatists because they've been part of that whole milieu. Henry Jesse's church included members who had been baptized as believers and those who didn't want to do that. Right? There were a number of churches of that description for some years after that. So looking further ahead here, John Bunyan's church in Bedford was precisely such a church that practiced both infant baptism and believers' baptism, depending on the conviction of the members. Right? But they really, really want that kind of acceptance, even though they know that they are being and can be castigated as, quote, Anabaptists. And they want to say, oh, no, we're not like that at all. They, finding us out of that common roadway they themselves walk, have smote us both in pulpit and print, charging us with holding free will. That's not us, that's the General Baptists. Falling away from grace. That's not us, that's the General Baptists. Denying original sin. That's not even the General Baptists, actually. That's the Mennonites, of whom there are not really any in England. Disclaiming of magistracy, denying to assist them either in persons or purse in any of their lawful commands. Not really true of any of them. Doing acts unseemly in the dispensing the ordinance of baptism, not to be named amongst Christians. What was that? Well, if viewers like to go back, and we should have mentioned this earlier, to the beginning of this episode, you'll see that central cartoon had people being baptized naked. And this is really getting to them. They're saying, we're not like that at all. We're not behaving like that. That's simply bad stuff that people like Daniel Featley and others are saying or implying about us. Right? All which charges we disclaim as notoriously untrue, though by reason of these calumnies cast upon us, many that fear God are discouraged and forestalled in harbouring a good thought, either of us or what we profess, and many that know not God, encouraged, if they can find the place of our meeting, to get together in clusters to stone us, as looking upon us as a people holding such things as that we're not worthy to live. Okay, now we get down to at least some of the items, because it's very long, we certainly can't look at all of it, but some of the key items of their confession of faith. So item 21, that Christ Jesus, by his death, did bring forth salvation and reconciliation only for the elect, which were those which God the Father gave him.
So they're stressing here their Calvinism.
Yes, that's right. And why we call them particular Baptists. They believe in a particular atonement only for the predestined elect. That Christ hath here on earth a spiritual kingdom, which is the church, which he hath purchased and redeemed to himself as a peculiar inheritance, which church, as it is visible to us, that means insofar as it is visible to us, is a company of visible saints. Visible saints in Puritan speak meant people whom we might charitably believe, perhaps, to be Christians, they being neither scandalous in life nor erroneous in belief. Of course, their Calvinism tells them that you can't really know who is a Christian, but visible saints meant people whom we might charitably hope are saints. Called and separated from the world by the word and spirit of God to the visible profession of the faith of the gospel, being baptized into that faith and joined to the Lord and each other by mutual agreement in the practical enjoyment of the ordinances commanded by Christ, their head and king. That being thus joined, every church has power given them from Christ for their better well-being to choose to themselves meet, means suitable, persons into the office of pastors, teachers, and elders and deacons. That the due maintenance of the offices aforesaid should be the free and voluntary communication of the church. That according to Christ's ordinance, they that preach the gospel should live on the gospel, and not by constraint to be compelled from the people by a forced law. Now, words in squiggly brackets here and later in the next page or so are words deleted from the second edition after discussions with Daniel Featley in order not to offend the Puritan constituency. So They're not wanting to damn completely the idea of compulsory tithes paid by the population as a whole. That baptism is an ordinance of the New Testament given by Christ to be dispensed only upon persons professing faith. And you can see there that the word only has been deleted in the second edition, or that are disciples or taught who upon profession of faith ought to be baptized. The way and manner of the dispensing of this ordinance, the scripture holds out to be, and again you can see those words are deleted in the second edition, dipping and plunging the whole body under water. It being a sign must answer the thing signified. And the margin has the word baptizo signifying to dip under water, yet so as with convenient garments, both upon the administrator and subject with all modesty. So those line drawings really have them spooked. The persons designed by Christ to dispense this ordinance, the scriptures hold forth to be a preaching disciple, it being nowhere tied to a particular church officer or person extraordinarily sent.
Okay, right at the end here, you better explain this to us. I mean, what the heck is a preaching disciple? And where do the scriptures hold forth that only such a person can baptize?
Well, it is a ridiculous expression, yes, and they were mocked for it at the time. But it's kind of a result, perhaps, of committee theology. On the one hand, they did not want to say that only the pastor can baptize. But on the other hand, they didn't want to say that just any member of the congregation could. Or, horrors, a woman. So they want to restrict it somewhat. So they coined this expression. Yeah.
Right.
Now, Murray Ptolemy, coming back to this wonderful man again, he comments the ingrained suspicion of Puritan clergymen schooled through a lifetime of study of the continental divines, Protestant reformers, on the errors of the Anabaptists was not easily to be overcome. And the point to be made there is that if you are schooled in a particular kind of way all your life and been surrounded by other people who support that way of looking at things, you won't really clearly be able to see what's in front of you. I mean, this was the criticism that had been made of late medieval scholasticism. It's certainly true of the Puritan clergymen who saw everything through a particular kind of grid, and there were these categories, and radicals were Anabaptists, and Anabaptists were the crazy people who'd done the stuff at Minster. Therefore, that must be what these are, right? We see it in other times and places as well, including, we might say, with the people coming out of the woke madrasas that pass for universities in countries like Britain and America today. Right? Everything is cut and dried. There's the categories. And it makes it very hard for them even to see what's in front of them. So the particular Baptists have got a very hard job on their hands.
Right.
Now, we should mention also this guy, Thomas Edwards. He was a Puritan clergyman of Presbyterian opinions, and in 1646 he produces this massive work, Gangrena, the full text of which is available online for anybody who can stand to wade through all of that. It was an angrily polemical attack upon sectarians of all kinds.
So he's basically an even grumpier version of the guy that we looked at the beginning, Daniel Feely.
Yes, that's exactly what he is. And here is an excerpt in which he describes the General Baptist congregation led by Thomas Lamb. There is one Lamb that was a soap boiler, and a church that meets in Bell Alley and Coleman Street called Lamb's Church. This man and his church are very erroneous, strange doctrines being vented there continually. Many used to resort to this church, especially young youths and wenches, flock thither, and all of them preach universal redemption. So, rejecting Calvinism. I have discovered much more of their anarchical and anti-magistratical spirit, many of these last errors plainly showing that they are enemies to all government, order, and distinction meaning social distinctions and rank, and would bring all into a popular confusion, and that as often as the weak judgments and humours of the giddy, inconstant multitude pleased.
Yikes. I mean, that last sentence, he sounds like an ancient Roman senator despising the common people.
And that's exactly really what he is, only in 17th century England. Yes. People choosing for themselves their religion, then you're choosing the most important thing in life. Right? So that must surely bring in anarchy. This is what pretty much everybody in 16th and 17th century Europe, including England, took as an axiomatic truth. And the catastrophe in Münster of 115 years or so before simply proved it.
Right, right.
Now, the Baptists did well during the period of the Civil War and Commonwealth, and by 1660 there were roughly 30,000 of each flavour. 30,000 General Baptists, 30,000 Particular Baptists. And we can't pursue that story any further here. But we should cast our eyes across the Atlantic to this man, Roger Williams, and the Rhode Island colony. Here is a 19th century statue made of him. He is the first American Baptist, originally a Puritan minister. He'd become a separatist by 1630 and then left England, as so many of that sort did, and arrived outside of Boston, New England in 1631. But his growing conviction that religion must not be enforced led to him being banished from Boston. He established a new settlement in Providence in 1636 and became a Baptist in 1638.
But he only remains a Baptist for a few months.
Yes, that's extremely embarrassing. It's true. He's a Baptist trailblazer in America, but doesn't remain a Baptist for long. But he's always a sympathizer of them. He moves into a kind of non-denominational position of his own, wondering really whether any denomination can get it right, rather perhaps like some of the spiritualists whom we noticed in earlier episodes in this series, and a sympathizer too of the Quakers, whom we will consider next week. He writes a number of very important works, but he's most famous for this one, published in 1644, The Bloody Tenent, or Tenet, as we would say, of Persecution for Cause of Conscience, discussed in a conference between truth and peace. And it's a very powerful case for freedom of conscience and against religious persecution. We'll look at that in just one moment. But we should notice that John Cotton, his enemy, the most prominent of the Boston clerical establishment, wrote a furious rejoinder called The Bloody Tenet, Washed and Made White in the Blood of the Lamb. And Williams produced a counterblast called The Bloody Tenent, Yet More Bloody. But those titles tell you a lot about how literary exchanges were carried on in the 16th and 17th centuries. Well, fortunately for us, on the very first page, he sets out his main points. First, that the blood of so many 100,000 souls of Protestants and Papists spilt in the wars of present and former ages. And of course, he's writing during the later stages of the 30 Years' War, which had resulted in literally millions of deaths in continental Europe. For their respective consciences is not required nor accepted by Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace. Secondly, pregnant scriptures and arguments are throughout the work proposed against the doctrine of persecution for the cause of conscience. Thirdly, satisfactory answers are given to scriptures and objections produced by Mr. Calvin. Beza had been Calvin's successor in Geneva, and both he and Calvin were long dead by the time Williams wrote. Mr. Cotton, who was very much alive, and the ministers of the new English churches, and others, former and later, tending to prove the doctrine of persecution for cause of conscience. Fourthly, the doctrine of persecution for cause of conscience is proved guilty of all the blood of the souls crying for vengeance under the altar. And the reference, of course, is to the book of Revelation. Fifthly, all civil states, with their officers of justices in their respective constitutions, administrations, are proved essentially civil, and therefore not judges, governors, or defenders of the spiritual or Christian state and worship. Sixthly, it is the will and command of God that since the coming of his Son, the Lord Jesus, a permission of the most paganish, Jewish, Turkish, or anti-Christian consciences and worships be granted to all men in all nations and countries, and they are only to be fought against with that sword which is only in soul matters able to conquer, to wit, the sword of God's Spirit, the Word of God. Seventhly, and this touches on something that we discussed in the last episode, the state of the land of Israel, the kings and people thereof in peace and war, is proved figurative and ceremonial, and no pattern nor precedent for any kingdom or civil state in the world to follow. So he's there totally undermining, and quite rightly so, the false equivalence made between the people of England and the people of Old Testament Israel, or whatever country we're talking about. So, yes.
Now, the Anabaptists would have actually agreed with all of that, except that Williams is turning religious toleration into a political position, while the Anabaptists were simply silent on such topics.
Yes, they didn't even propose a religious toleration. The Anabaptists just simply said, we're a real church. You claim to be Christians but are persecuting us. This proves you're not real Christians. Whereas Williams is taking it to actually make a political position on that limited point. Yes. Yes.
Okay, so next week we're moving on to the Quakers, and they're an even bigger departure, really, from the established churches.
Yes, they are, and in some ways, a departure from theological orthodoxy.
Well, okay, but is that a good enough reason to call next week's episode "I'll Shove Your Teeth Down Your Throat"?
Oh, that must have got in there by mistake. I thought that was what you said to me after we'd finished recording last time.
Oh, yes. Oops.
Yes. No, seriously, it is one absolutely irate country gentleman said to his son, call me thou again, sirrah, and I'll shove your teeth down your throat, because the Quakers believed in addressing everybody with thee and thou, the familiar form, rather than the polite you, which you were supposed to address your father with in those days. So, yes, but anyway, more of that anon.
Alrighty, everyone. Well, we hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, or really if you didn't, we would kindly ask you to repost it on social media, share it with all of your friends, like and comment our videos so that we can be successful on our way to becoming internet famous.
This is it. This is it, really. We're going for the big bucks. Thank you, everybody, for staying with us. Yes, and as Coel said, please do like, repost. Please repost. And your comments are all welcome. Well, mostly welcome. And we'll look forward to seeing you again next week. Thank you, everybody, and bye-bye now.
Bye, everyone.